On a quiet summer night in London in the year 1952, a woman lay dying in the dim corridor of a modest hotel. A hand had struck her down, not in battle, not upon the field where spies and soldiers had once measured courage against death, but in the plain ordinariness of peacetime, where she had so often felt like a stranger. She was Christine Granville, though once she had been Christina Skarbek, daughter of Poland, beloved of Churchill's War Office, and one of the most daring figures in that long twilight of Europe's suffering. Dear listener, I welcome you to this gathering of memory, where time is not hurried and where stories flow like the steady current of a river. If you are here, share in the comments when and where you are listening, so that this telling may weave itself into a great fabric of remembrance, binding one night to another across the earth. And if you wish to support these wanderings through history, let your hand touch the subscribe button, so this lantern of memory may burn more steadily. The final hours of Christine Granville's life did not resemble the heroic stage where she had once played her part with brilliance and daring. She had survived the Gestapo, the mountains, the suspicion of allies, the endless shadow that falls upon those who carry false papers and whispered names. Yet on that night in June, it was not an empire, not an army, but a single lonely man who undid her. He was a ship's steward she had spurned, overcome by jealousy and desperation. And so, as the lamps flickered in the dim hallway of the Shelbourne Hotel, her long journey was stilled by a knife's sudden intrusion, and silence closed upon her as if the world had forgotten her victories. What is it in the lives of heroes that brings such dissonance between the fire of their youth and the solitude of their end? One might imagine that for a woman decorated by generals, praised by statesmen, and trusted by agents who knew only danger as their companion, some safe harbor would have been prepared. Yet Christine seemed always exiled, even from peace itself, as though the storms of the war she had courted would never leave her spirit in quiet. Those who found her spoke of her beauty, though faded by the years, of her proud bearing, of the strength that clung to her, even in death. And they whispered, perhaps with unease, that such a woman had been the favorite spy of Winston Churchill himself, and that her deeds had tipped the balance of peril in places far from London. But the newspapers, filled with other stories, gave her passing only small space, a column here, a few words there. The world had little room for women whose heroism did not fit the patterns of tidy victory. Let us, then, draw back the curtain of time and look not only upon her death, but upon the whole of her journey to see what manner of spirit this was. For in telling, perhaps the silence that covered her grave may be broken, and her name carried again like a candle into the dark corridors of forgetting. She was born Christina Skarbek in 1908 in the land of Poland, a nation whose soil had known division and sorrow for generations. Her father was a nobleman, proud but careless, a man whose fortune dwindled with each passing year. Her mother, Jewish by birth, brought another kind of lineage, one that would later mark Christina in a Europe descending into hatred. From childhood, she knew the fragility of status and the precariousness of identity, for wealth slipped away as surely as the seasons and names themselves could carry danger. Yet in her youth there was also a brightness. She rode horses with a fierce joy, the cold air of the Polish countryside whipping her face, the forests echoing with her laughter. There was a wildness in her, a refusal to be confined by the strictures of polite society. Stories tell of her defiance even as a girl, of how she once placed her bare leg upon a hot stove in protest of an insult, enduring the pain with a stubborn pride. Such tales, half remembered, half embellished, reveal something of the fire that would carry her later into impossible missions. Marriage came early to a man of good standing, but it did not last. She sought more than comfort, more than the life of a quiet wife among the drawing rooms of Warsaw. Some said she was restless, some said she was reckless, and perhaps both were true. For Christina longed for movement, for purpose, for a stage where her spirit might find its full measure. It was not peace she desired, but challenge, not security, but the edge of uncertainty. And then, as if the world itself had conspired to provide her such a stage, came the outbreak of war. The year 1939 broke upon Poland like a hammer, with armies advancing and skies blackened by machines of conquest. Christina, fleeing with others, carried with her not despair, but a fierce will to fight. She sought no corner to hide, but instead made her way toward Britain, where rumors spoke of a secret service forming under the direction of Churchill, who knew the need for daring souls unafraid of impossible odds. Thus the young woman, once only a restless spirit upon Polish fields, became Christine Granville, her new name forged as a weapon, her new life bound to shadows. And here, in this transformation, her true story begins. Yet before we stride too quickly into her missions and triumphs, let us pause a moment at the threshold. The sound of her last footsteps in the London corridor still lingers, fading into silence. The faint echo becomes the memory of other footsteps long ago, upon snowy mountain paths where borders were crossed in secret, where Christine carried not only her own fate, but the hopes of many who would never know her name. Those footsteps upon the snow, soft and muffled, lead us not only across borders but backwards in time, into the early years when Christine was still Christina, a child of Poland, a land of shifting frontiers and enduring sorrow. Snow was always near in her youth, falling thick upon the fields of Mazovia, cloaking the woods where wolves howled and children ran, their cheeks stung with cold. To be Polish in those years was to live with absence, for the nation had long been partitioned, its independence battered by the designs of neighbors more powerful than itself. Yet in those valleys and among those forests, there remained a pride that could not be erased, and it was into this mixture of fragility and defiance that she was born in 1908. Her father, Count Jerzy Skarbek, belonged to the old nobility, though his fortune was fading like a candle too long burned. He was tall, handsome, a man who lived as if money were endless, even as debts pressed closer. He carried himself with a pride rooted less in reality than in memory, for the aristocracy of Poland had once been vast, and to him its dignity was not yet gone. Christina adored him, saw in him the romantic figure of tales, though others judged him careless and wasteful. Her mother, Stefania, was of Jewish heritage, a woman of refinement and quiet strength. She knew the precarious place her lineage occupied in a country where prejudice smoldered beneath the surface, waiting for the chance to flame. Between these two, the extravagant father and the vigilant mother, the child grew with both recklessness and caution entwined within her. The great house where they lived in Trzepnica had cracks in its walls and drafts that chilled the halls, but to a child it was still a manor, a place of horses in the stables, of orchards in blossom, of tapestries fading yet rich with stories. Christina learned to ride almost as soon as she could walk, her small hands clutching the reins, her laughter scattering through the fields. She felt alive upon the back of a horse, as if the animal's power flowed through her own limbs, as if the wind itself were an ally. That early mastery of risk, of balancing at speed, of trusting instinct rather than hesitation, was a lesson no finishing school could ever offer. She was not a quiet child. There are stories told of her willfulness, how she once placed her bare leg upon a burning stove after her father had mocked her courage. She held it there until the flesh blistered, proof that she would never be cowed. The tale may have grown in the telling, as such tales often do, yet even if only half true, it reveals the defiance already burning in her. Pain did not frighten her. Shame did not bind her. She would rather scar herself than submit. School did not contain her restlessness. She preferred the company of grooms, of hunters, of the wide fields rather than the narrow lessons of etiquette. She was beautiful in a way that was still unformed. Sharp eyes beneath a dark brow, a quick smile that could turn suddenly serious. Boys noticed her. Teachers despaired of her distraction. Her mother tried to discipline her, yet she could not quench the flame. It was in these years that the first whispers of unease touched her life. Poland, caught between empires, shifted beneath her feet. The Great War came, and with it, hunger and disruption. Armies tramped across the land, borders moved again. When in 1918 Poland rose from partitions to stand once more as an independent state, the nation celebrated, but the soil still bore scars, and her family, once secure, found themselves less certain of their place. Wealth had dwindled, debts pressed in. Christina knew what it was to see pride held high even as cupboards grew empty. She learned early that appearances were masks, that beneath noble titles and polished manners lay fragility. Perhaps this lesson made her later so adept at wearing masks herself, passing under false names, moving with the ease of one who knows identity is but a garment to be changed. As she grew into a young woman, her beauty sharpened, and so did the perception of others. Suitors came, drawn by the name of Scarbeck and by her fiery charm. She was courted, admired, envied, yet in her heart she remained restless. Comfort did not tempt her. She dreamed of travel, of far mountains, of challenges that would demand her whole being, and she was often impatient, unable to abide the slow rituals of salons and polite conversations. Her world, she felt, was too small for her spirit. Marriage came early to Gustav Gettlich, a businessman of some means, steady and respectable. He offered her security, and for a time she seemed content. Yet within months, the old restlessness stirred. She found the life of a merchant's wife stifling, the routine unbearable. Her husband could not follow her into her storms of spirit, and the marriage ended swiftly. Divorce was still whispered of in society, but Christina did not mind whispers. She left behind comfort for uncertainty, as she would so often do, choosing the open road over the safe harbor. It was perhaps inevitable that she sought out work and activity that carried danger and independence. She trained as a journalist. She involved herself with circles where politics and adventure mingled. She traveled, she observed. She sharpened her wits. She seemed always to be leaning forward, searching for the next threshold to cross. Friends described her as magnetic, alive, both captivating and unpredictable. Some admired her courage, others muttered of recklessness, but all agreed she could not be ignored. The snow still fell upon the fields of her childhood, yet she was no longer the child running through drifts. She was a woman of 20 and more, her life stretching ahead into shadows, yet unknown. The Europe she lived in was uneasy. The 1930s brought the rise of powers that threatened to consume smaller nations. Germany grew loud and menacing. Italy strutted in militaristic display. The Soviet Union loomed with its own hunger. Poland, newly reborn, trembled between them like a candle in a draught. Christina must have felt this, must have sensed that her destiny was not to be lived in quiet villages, but in the great turmoil that was gathering. And still she sought love, companionship, perhaps a partner who could match her. She married again to Jerzy Gajicki, a diplomat and explorer whose postings promised travel and wider horizons. With him she traveled to Ethiopia, to far lands where the dust rose in foreign winds and the stars seemed strange. For a time, this union seemed to offer her both adventure and belonging. Yet even here, the pattern of her life repeated. She remained restless, difficult to contain. The marriage gave her the name by which she would later be remembered in Britain, Granville, the anglicized version that accompanied her into legend. But the bond itself would loosen. Her childhood, her youth, These early marriages and journeys all formed a pattern of movement, of never settling, of always seeking. She was both aristocrat and exile, both beloved and alone, always on the threshold of another departure. It is easy to see with the long hindsight of history how such a spirit would be drawn irresistibly into the clandestine world of espionage when war erupted. She was already a wanderer, already practiced in shedding skins, already in search of a cause worthy of her fire. And yet one must ask, was she already haunted by an emptiness that peace could never fill? Was the snow of her childhood always underfoot, reminding her that permanence was illusion, that only motion, only defiance against the cold, gave meaning? Perhaps. For in Christine, as she would become, we see not only bravery but also a refusal of stillness, a life that could not bear to be confined. The footsteps in the snow fade again, and the sound becomes that of a restless wind moving eastward, carrying with it the breath of storms yet to come. That restless wind moving eastward carries with it the fragrance of smoke from village hearths and the bitter scent of soil long trampled by armies. It moves across plains and mountains, across the towns of Poland, where once again, in the years of the 1930s, uncertainty grew heavy in the air. For Christine, still Christina in those days, the wind seemed always to summon her away from the familiar. She was a woman of marriageable age, yet marriage had already twice failed to root her. To those who watched, she seemed caught between worlds, aristocratic in name, restless as a gypsy in spirit, unafraid of scandal, never content with what society thought enough. Her union with Jerzy Gizicki, the diplomat, had taken her far beyond the borders of Poland. She traveled with him to Ethiopia, where the highlands baked in the sun and the mountains lifted in dry majesty. Here she tasted the life of an adventurer's wife, among officials and envoys, and in evenings she heard the strange calls of birds, unfamiliar to European ears. She must have looked out over those wide African landscapes with a sensation both of awe and of recognition, for she belonged not to one land but to the horizon itself. Yet in her heart the old disquiet stirred. Her husband, absorbed in his duties and ambitions, could not still it. The rhythm of diplomatic society, with its receptions and reports, did not satisfy her. She longed not for the safe progress of a career, but for risk, for something that would test the edges of her being. And so, as before, the bond weakened. She returned often to Poland, to her mother, to old friends, to her own unending hunger for more. Restlessness had by now become her companion, and in its company, scandal followed her like a shadow. She was beautiful, undeniably so, with dark eyes that could flash with both amusement and disdain, with a figure lithe and quick, with a manner that could charm or unsettle as she chose. Men fell in love with her easily, and she let them, though she gave little of herself in return. She was never bound, never still. Love for her was a flame to warm her briefly, then left behind as she continued her wandering. Warsaw in those years was a place of tension and elegance, a city where cafes buzzed with talk of politics, where artists and writers argued in smoky rooms, where officers strolled in bright uniforms along the boulevards. Christine moved through it all like a current of air, always seen, always remarked upon. Some envied her independence, others criticized her recklessness. Yet she did not bend herself to please. She spoke freely, she acted as she wished, and though whispers followed, she seemed impervious. The world itself was restless too. The 30s were years of gathering thunder. Across the western border, Germany seethed under Hitler's rise. His speeches reached even into Poland, carried on radios, reported in papers, a harsh rhythm of threats and promises. In the east, Stalin's Soviet Union loomed, its secret terrors spoken of only in low voices. Poland, newly resurrected from long partitions, found itself again a fragile shield between two powers, hungry for conquest. And Christine, though she was no politician, could not have been blind to this storm. Perhaps she felt it instinctively, the way a horse senses thunder before it breaks, the way a restless spirit trembles with the nearness of destiny. Still, life went on. There were dances, there were friends, there was the theater, there were journeys taken by train across the countryside. But beneath it all was the knowledge, perhaps unspoken, that something immense was drawing closer. For Christine, this gave her restlessness new sharpness. What was the use of comfort, of safety, when the world itself was tipping toward danger? She longed for action, for a stage large enough for her defiance. It would soon come. One story tells of her sitting in a Warsaw cafe in those years, her eyes following the people passing in the street. She remarked that the city seemed like a ballroom where dancers whirled faster and faster, never noticing that the walls were beginning to burn. Such a remark may be apocryphal, but it suits her. She was always aware of the currents beneath appearances, always impatient with denial. She saw through the masks of society because she herself had practiced wearing them. Her mother, Stefania, must have worried for her. To be half Jewish in Poland was to live with unease, for prejudice lay not far below the surface. Christine's beauty and charm protected her. Her father's noble name shielded her. But identity could not be hidden if the world turned crueler. Perhaps Stefania urged her daughter toward stability, toward safety. But Christine could not choose such a path. She would not play a smaller role for the sake of caution. By the late 1930s, as she entered her 30s, Christine was no longer the reckless girl, but a woman sharpened by choices, by marriages begun and broken, by journeys across continents, by a sense that time itself was pressing her forward. And then, in September of 1939, the storm broke at last. German armies crossed Poland's borders, and the land of her childhood was torn apart in fire and steel. The wind that had carried her restlessness eastward now turned into the howl of war. And Christine, instead of fleeing into despair, found in it the very stage she had awaited all her life. It is said that when others spoke of surrender, she laughed. When friends wondered where to hide, she thought only of how to fight. She left Poland as armies closed in, traveling southward, making her way through Hungary, seeking the chance not merely to survive but to resist. She was already imagining herself as a weapon, already preparing to offer her courage to whatever cause would stand against tyranny. But before the missions, before the code names and the daring escapes, there was still a moment of uncertainty. She did not yet know if Britain would accept her. She did not know if she would be permitted to serve. She only knew she must try. Her life had prepared her for this: the masks, the restlessness, the refusal of safety, the hunger for risk. The war gave her purpose as nothing else had. The restless wind that had carried her across continents now rushed through railway stations crowded with refugees, through fields where columns of displaced people trudged in silence, through the hearts of those who knew that Europe was falling into darkness. Christine was among them, moving swiftly, her eyes not on the ground but on the horizon. And as she passed through stations, as she crossed borders with forged papers and quick smiles, the cry of departing trains followed her. That sound, the iron wheels grinding against the rails, the whistles shrill in the night, was the accompaniment to her flight and to her destiny. The cry of departing trains echoed through the night, long and mournful, as if the iron throats of the engines carried the grief of a nation. On the platforms, under flickering lamps, stood crowds of women and children, clutching bundles of hurriedly gathered belongings, their faces pale with fear, their eyes darting toward the horizon that now burned with advancing war. Among them, though her bearing was proud and her step steady, moved Christina Skarbek. She was not yet Christine Granville in name, though the mask of that identity would soon be placed upon her. She was a woman leaving behind her country, not to abandon it, but to search for a way to fight for its soul. September of 1939 had torn Poland apart in a matter of weeks. German forces thundered in from the west, their tanks grinding across the plains, their aircraft shrieking over the rooftops. From the east, Stalin's armies marched, silent and merciless, claiming their half of the prize agreed upon in the secret pact. For Poland, there was no chance. Its armies were brave but outmatched, its land doomed to be carved once more by empires. For Christina, the daughter of a fading aristocracy, this was more than political tragedy. It was the erasure of the soil that had shaped her, the obliteration of the land where her father's horses had once run free. Yet despair did not claim her. She saw in the destruction only the demand for defiance. Her husband Jerzy, the diplomat, was with her in these early days of exile, their union, already fragile, held together for a time by the shared urgency of flight. From Warsaw, they moved southward into Hungary, across borders already patrolled by soldiers, through towns where suspicion lurked in every uniformed glance. In Budapest, they paused, uncertain of their next step, yet certain they could not remain idle. Europe itself was collapsing into darkness. The corridors of power whispered of Britain and France, of government still standing against the Nazi storm. Perhaps there lay hope. Perhaps there she could offer her courage. In Budapest, she began to reveal the qualities that would soon make her invaluable to the secret war. Her charm opened doors. Her wit disarmed questions. She moved with a lightness, passing from salon to railway office, from cafe to embassy, gathering rumors, weaving contacts. She had the gift of listening, of drawing out confidences, of appearing both harmless and fascinating at once. Already she was practicing the craft that would later save lives, the art of becoming what others expected her to be, while hiding beneath that mask her own fierce determination. But Hungary, though for the moment outside the German grasp, was no safe haven. The noose of influence tightened, and the exile community buzzed with uncertainty. It was then, in those months, that Christina conceived of her bold step, to reach Britain, to offer herself directly to those who sought to fight Germany with all means, even those of shadow and secrecy. It was not enough for her to wait. She needed to act. Her restless spirit, which had carried her from marriage to marriage, from land to land, now burned with clarity. War had given her a purpose at last. The journey westward was not easy. Borders were closing. Papers were questioned. Trains were crowded with desperate passengers. Yet she passed again and again, slipping through checkpoints with the confidence of one who refuses to imagine failure. Some said she smiled at guards and they let her pass. Others said she feigned ignorance or illness or simply projected such conviction that suspicion melted away. However she did it, she reached her destination. France first, then Britain, the island that still held against the tide. It was winter when she arrived in London, the city dimmed by blackout curtains, its streets patrolled, its air thick with anticipation of the bombs that had not yet begun to fall. Here, in the heart of a nation girding itself for survival, Christina presented herself, not as a refugee seeking shelter, but as a fighter demanding to serve. It was a bold gesture, for Britain was wary of strangers, suspicious of spies, uncertain whom to trust. Yet she was not deterred. She carried with her not only courage, but also knowledge of Poland, of its mountains and its people, of the ways across its borders, of the networks of loyalty that could still resist the occupation. The British in these early days were gathering such souls into a new force, one that would later be called the Special Operations Executive. Churchill himself urged it on, declaring that Europe must be set ablaze. To light those flames, he needed men and women willing to slip behind enemy lines, to risk capture, torture, death, in order to keep alive the spirit of defiance. In Christina, they found not only willingness, but eagerness. She was among the very first women recruited into this clandestine service. Her new identity was fashioned. Christine Granville, a name that carried both familiarity and concealment, both European grace and English neutrality. With this mask she would operate, though behind it, her spirit remained that of Christina, proud daughter of Poland, restless seeker of destiny. She trained in the arts of espionage, though often her natural instincts surpassed any formal lesson. She learned codes, invisible inks, the handling of weapons. Yet what made her most effective could not be taught. Her quickness of wit, her fearless improvisation, her ability to charm or deceive in an instant. Looking back, one can see how every strand of her earlier life had prepared her for this. The fated nobility taught her to carry herself with confidence, even when fortune was gone. Her mother's lineage gave her the awareness of danger, the instinct to hide what must not be revealed. Her childhood rides across dangerous fields gave her balance and daring. Her failed marriages left her unattached, free to throw herself wholly into a cause, and her restless heart ensured she would never shrink from peril. Still, in those first days in London, she was but one among many refugees pressing forward with offers of service. Her accent marked her. Her beauty made her memorable. Some doubted her seriousness, others her stability. Yet those who gave her tasks quickly learned she was extraordinary. Sent back to Hungary with secret instructions, she slipped through borders under false papers, carrying messages, carrying hope. She began to live the double life that would define her. Christine by name, but Christina in spirit. Always between worlds, always walking the narrow edge between survival and exposure. And so, from the cry of departing trains in occupied Poland, she had arrived at last in the shadowed offices of London, where a single candle burned upon a desk, its light flickering upon maps and coded documents. That candle, in a way, was her own flame. Newly recognized, about to be sent into the darkness of Europe. Its glow lit the beginning of her true legend. The single candle flickered in the London office, its light bending as though uncertain against the weight of blackout shadows pressed hard against the window panes. Outside, the city moved in whispers, streets hushed, windows covered, the lamps dimmed to slits so that no enemy aircraft might guide their bombs. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and damp wool, for Britain in 1940 was a land both determined and anxious, caught between memory of old victories and the dread of invasion now spoken of openly. Within those shadowed rooms where decisions were made, a different war was being prepared, a war of whispers, disguises, and unseen movements. It was here that Christine, still new to these corridors, was welcomed into Churchill's secret circle. The man who had called for Europe to be set ablaze understood the need for unusual souls, people who could cross borders with nothing but forged papers and steady nerves, who could carry messages across mountains or slip secrets from unwilling tongues. Christine was not the first to arrive at the service of the Special Operations Executive, but she was among its most striking presences. Her beauty caught the eye, her voice lingered in memory, her aristocratic bearing gave her the poise of authority, yet it was her daring spirit that convinced those who watched her closely. She did not seek protection, nor comfort, nor recognition. She sought only to act, to throw herself into the very heart of peril. In those first weeks she underwent training, though her impatience often made her instructors smile. She was taught to handle small weapons, to send coded transmissions, to memorize false identities so deeply that they could be spoken without hesitation, even under sudden questioning. She learned the art of invisibility, not by hiding in shadows, but by drawing no suspicion when she stood in plain sight. For Christine carried within her the rare gift of presence. She could be unforgettable when she wished, yet nearly invisible when danger demanded. The offices where she prepared smelled of ink and tobacco, of damp coats hung upon chairs, of maps pinned upon walls with colored lines tracing the veins of Europe's struggle. Men spoke in low voices of networks to be built, of trains to be infiltrated, of bridges to be cut, of hopes to be carried across hostile ground. Christine listened, and though she was a woman in a world still reluctant to grant women equal place, she pressed herself forward. Her will admitted no denial. She was not content to be a messenger. She demanded to be in the field, and soon she was. Her first great test came in the mission that would carry her back across the mountains into Hungary, back toward the soil she had crossed as an exile. Armed only with a new name and the confidence that seemed to flow from her very being, she set forth. The cold bit at her face. The paths were narrow, the patrols alert. Yet she passed, sometimes smiling, sometimes feigning indifference, sometimes relying on sheer boldness. Her companions marveled. Where others hesitated, she moved with the ease of one who believed the world itself would bend to let her pass. It was not bravado, though some thought so. It was instinct. Christine seemed to know with unshakable clarity that fear betrayed more than false papers ever could. A trembling hand, a wavering voice, the flicker of doubt in the eyes, these were the true marks of guilt. She, therefore, made herself calm, even playful when questioned. Her humor, her charm, her sudden disarming laugh could turn suspicion into courtesy. She crossed borders that others feared, carrying messages that kept alive the fragile networks of resistance. There is a story told of one such crossing, when a guard, suspicious of her accent, questioned her harshly. Christine leaned forward, her dark eyes meeting his with sudden intimacy, and said softly that if he wished, she could tell him more, but only when they were alone. The man, flustered, let her pass, unwilling to expose his interest before his comrades. Whether entirely true or not, the story reflects her method. She turned every moment of risk into an opportunity, wielding charm as others wielded knives. Back in London, reports of her success reached the ears of her superiors. They began to recognize that in her was a rare instrument, one forged not merely by training, but by the unique alloy of courage and recklessness. Churchill himself, when her name was mentioned, is said to have smiled, remarking that she was precisely the sort of spirit the war required. To be spoken of by him was honor indeed, though Christine wore honors lightly. She sought not medals but missions. She thrived only when placed again upon the edge. The months passed and Britain endured. The bombs began to fall, the sirens wailed in the night, the streets of London shook beneath fire and rubble. Yet amid the destruction, the quiet war of shadows continued, and Christine was at its center. She slipped again into Europe, again into danger, bringing out messages, bringing back hope. Each time she returned, her legend grew among those who whispered of agents whose courage might yet keep alive the chance of liberation. And so the candle upon that London desk, flickering uncertainly in the blackout, grew brighter in the minds of those who knew her name. Christine Granville had become more than an exile seeking purpose. She had become one of Churchill's favorite spies, a woman whose daring seemed almost fated. But fame in the world of shadows is a dangerous gift. To be known is to be vulnerable. To be admired is to be envied. Already there were whispers, already suspicions, already the shadows of betrayal. Still, Christine pressed forward, undeterred, for she lived only when the mission demanded everything, when the path led into danger from which there was no certain return. Peace for her was a suffocating silence. Only war gave her breath. The candle burned low, its wax pooling, its flame bending toward extinction. A coded message lay beside it, waiting to be carried into the dark. Somewhere in that silence, Christine rose, took the message in her hands, and prepared to step once more into the night. The coded message, folded and discreet, rested in her hand like a living thing, pulsing with the weight of lives hidden in its lines of numbers and letters. To the untrained eye, it was nothing, perhaps a scrap of paper forgotten in a pocket, but Christine knew each word was a flame waiting to burn in the darkness of occupied Europe. She tucked it away as she had tucked away so many secrets, close to her body, close to her heart, and set forth once more into the night. The path before her led back toward Hungary, the land that had become both a station of exile and a bridge into peril. There she would operate again, crossing into Poland when chance allowed, carrying not only information but hope to those trapped within the iron embrace of the occupier. The winters were bitter, the mountains unforgiving, yet Christine moved across them with the steadiness of one who knew that hesitation was death. Snow bit at her cheeks, wind tore at her coat, but her steps were sure. She seemed to possess an instinct for survival, an inner compass that pointed not north or south, but always toward the narrow passage that lay between life and capture. It was during these crossings that her reputation began to grow, whispered first among fellow agents, then passed along through reports read in London. She moved through checkpoints as though they were doorways in her own house. At times she was bold, offering papers with a smile so casual that guards waved her on, convinced they faced a woman of consequence. At other times she played the part of the frightened refugee, wide-eyed and helpless, a role that drew pity rather than suspicion. She could shift her mask in an instant, adapting herself to the gaze of the one who stood before her. And each time, she passed. Yet her courage was not only in deception. She carried messages of immense danger, names of officers, plans of movements, warnings of betrayal. To be caught with such papers was to face torture without mercy. She knew this, and still she carried them, sometimes sewn into the lining of her coat, sometimes hidden in the hollow of a heel, sometimes committed to memory so nothing written could betray her. Her mind became a living archive, a vault where secrets could be stored without weight, ready to be revealed when the time was right. There is a story of how she brought out the news of German intentions on the Eastern Front, a message of such consequence that it shook the understanding of the Allies. Smuggled across borders, carried through icy passes, this message warned of Hitler's plan to turn against his temporary ally, the Soviet Union. Whether Christine was the sole bearer or one among many, her role was crucial. Without her, knowledge might have come too late. Her courage carried not only paper, but the fragile thread of strategy that could alter the course of nations. And still, she seemed untouched by fear. Companions marveled at her calm when patrols approached, at her quick smile when questioned, at her refusal to bow to intimidation. Was it recklessness, or was it a deeper strength, born of the scars she had carried since childhood? Perhaps it was both. Christine knew, as few did, that the body can endure pain, that the spirit can outlast terror. Fear might shake her hands in private, but never before those who sought to break her. Her charm, too, was a weapon, one she wielded with precision. She could flatter a guard until he forgot his orders, could draw out the sympathy of an official until he believed himself her protector. Some accused her of recklessness in her flirtations, yet Christine did not give herself away lightly. She used affection as she used false papers, as a means of survival, a shield against suspicion, a bridge to freedom. For her, love and danger often entwined, each feeding upon the other, each impossible to separate. In Budapest, where agents and exiles mingled in a haze of smoke and whispered alliances, she became a figure both admired and envied. Men spoke of her with awe, women with curiosity. She seemed to belong to no one and to everyone, a presence that unsettled as much as it inspired. Her name, Christine Granville, began to circulate in circles where survival depended upon daring. Some distrusted her, finding her too bold, too visible. Others adored her, seeing in her a courage they could not themselves summon, and always behind the charm lay the steel. When a mission required crossing frozen rivers by night, she went without complaint. When prisoners needed rescuing, she plotted with calm determination. When comrades faltered, she steadied them with a glance, as if her fearlessness could be borrowed for a moment. One officer who knew her said later that to be in her company was to feel that nothing was impossible, that the walls of occupation could be climbed, that the shadow of the Gestapo was not invincible. Yet even as she succeeded, danger drew nearer. Her name appeared on lists. Her face was described in whispers among those who hunted spies. She was not unknown to the Gestapo, though they could not catch her. Each mission brought her closer to exposure. Each border crossing a throw of dice weighted toward disaster. Still she pressed on. She would rather die in movement than live in stillness. There were nights when she sat in safe houses, waiting for the dawn to bring news or escape, the smell of damp stone in the air, the ticking of a clock louder than her own heartbeat. In those hours of solitude, did she ever question her path? Did she wonder if she would see her mother again, if she would walk once more in the orchards of her childhood? We cannot know. She left no confession, only the record of her relentless courage. Perhaps she felt most alive in those moments, balanced upon the edge of silence and danger, knowing that one wrong breath could betray her. As months became years, her legend grew, not only in London where her reports were read, but among those who saw her in action. She became not just a courier, but a symbol, proof that the human spirit, even in the face of tyranny, could remain unbroken. For the Poles who fought on in exile, she was a reminder of their nation's defiance. For the British who doubted whether women could serve in such roles, she was an answer that silenced skepticism. For her enemies, she was a shadow they could not seize. And yet, with every mission, with every daring success, the tension coiled tighter. How long can any spirit move upon the edge without stumbling? How long can courage protect against the net of suspicion cast by an enemy that misses nothing? These questions hovered around her, unanswered, even as she prepared again and again to slip into the night. At the end of one such night, as she returned to a safe flat in Budapest, she drew from her coat a letter, its edges damp from snow. She laid it upon the table, its code waiting to be unraveled, its words waiting to cross the channel to London. The room was quiet save for the crackle of a fire, and there, among the shadows, she hid the message within an envelope, sealing it as though it were a fragment of her very soul. The sound of the envelope's edge being pressed closed lingers still, carrying us forward, as though its faint rustle were the turning of a page that leads into another daring chapter. The envelope, its edge pressed closed by her steady hand, lay upon the table like a silent promise. Within its folds rested not only coded words, but also the lives of men waiting in prison cells, the fragile hopes of families scattered by war, the faint outline of freedom struggling against the heavy hand of occupation. Christine touched it lightly, as though reassuring herself that it was safe, then rose to continue her work, for there was no pause in the life she had chosen. The war demanded constant motion, constant risk, constant defiance. It was in those months when she moved between Hungary and occupied Poland that Christine first undertook the missions that would etch her name in the annals of courage. Among them was the rescue of Polish officers captured and imprisoned, men who had fought bravely and now faced the cruelty of their captors. To free them was no simple task. It required forged documents, careful persuasion, and above all, the ability to make others believe what was not true. And Christine, with her wit and her fearless eyes, excelled in this art. The story is told of how she secured the release of fellow agents by convincing the authorities that they were of vital importance, not as prisoners, but as potential collaborators. She wove her tale with such conviction, such ease, that suspicion melted away. To speak lies convincingly requires a calmness most cannot summon under pressure, yet Christine spoke as though truth itself flowed from her lips. The men walked free, bewildered at their sudden release, while their captors remained certain they had acted wisely. Only later would they realize they had been deceived by a woman who smiled even as she led her comrades out of danger. These rescues were not isolated deeds. Time and again she placed herself at risk for others, moving through prisons, through checkpoints, through railway stations heavy with uniforms and suspicion. Each time she slipped past barriers with an elegance that seemed to defy probability. It was not luck. It was the blend of nerve and instinct, of knowing when to press forward, when to yield, when to laugh, when to lower her eyes. She seemed to sense the rhythm of danger and step lightly between its beats. The mountains, too, became her pathways, their ridges sharp against the winter sky, their valleys filled with silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on snow. She led others across these treacherous passes, guiding fugitives, carrying messages, sometimes nearly collapsing from exhaustion, but never allowing herself to falter where others could see. She had the endurance of one driven by purpose, a fire within that outlasted cold and hunger. Those who walked with her spoke later of how she seemed to draw strength from the very elements, her breath forming clouds in the air, her dark eyes fixed always on the path ahead. Crossing borders became her art, as natural to her as breathing. Papers could be forged, accents softened, clothes altered, but the true test was the manner of the one who carried them. Christine knew that the human gaze was the most dangerous frontier of all. A guard's suspicion could unravel the finest counterfeit, and so she met those gazes head on, her calmness disarming, her confidence contagious. To question her seemed almost impolite, as though the very act of doubt would betray weakness in the one who doubted. In this way, she passed where others would have been stopped, her very presence opening gates that should have remained closed. Yet beneath the daring and the brilliance lay a question that lingers even now. What drove her? Was it patriotism, the fierce loyalty to Poland, whose soil she had seen consumed by invaders? Was it hatred of tyranny, sharpened by the knowledge of her mother's Jewish heritage and the peril it meant? Or was it something more personal, more restless, a need to prove herself against danger, to feel alive only when standing upon the edge? Perhaps it was all these at once, woven together into the single thread of her destiny. In the safe houses where she sometimes paused, she was both admired and resented. Men who worked beside her were astonished by her audacity, yet some whispered that she was reckless, that she drew too much attention, that she tempted fate. Women envied her beauty, her charm, the way she bent circumstances to her will. Yet even those who doubted her could not deny her effectiveness. When she was present, missions succeeded. When she intervened, prisoners were freed. When she carried a message, it arrived. Her results silenced criticism, even as her methods stirred unease. And Christine herself, how did she see it? She left behind few writings, no confessions of her inner thoughts. But in the way she lived, one senses she saw the world as a stage, each mission a performance where survival depended upon flawless improvisation. She reveled in the moment, never retreating into hesitation. Perhaps she understood that life, especially in war, was always uncertain, and so she chose to meet uncertainty with daring, as though to command it by sheer will. There is an image of her descending from the mountains after leading fugitives across the snow. Her hair, dark and windblown, clung to her face, her coat was torn, her boots soaked. Yet she laughed as she entered the safe house, laughed as though the hardship had been a game she had won. Her comrades stared at her in wonder, for who could laugh after such exhaustion? But Christine's laughter was her defiance, her refusal to let suffering claim her spirit. These moments, multiplied across the years of war, gave her the aura of legend. To many, she was no longer merely an agent, but a symbol of what courage could be. She carried with her the pride of a defeated nation, the resilience of the oppressed, the hope that tyranny was not invincible. Yet to herself, perhaps, she was simply living as she always had, unable to accept stillness, unwilling to be confined, finding in danger the meaning that ordinary life denied her. As the war deepened, the risks grew greater. The Gestapo grew more ruthless, their nets more finely woven. Comrades disappeared, captured or executed, their absence a silent reminder of how narrow the line was. Christine knew she was hunted, knew her name was whispered by those who sought her death, yet she pressed on undeterred. For what was life, if not spent entirely in pursuit of freedom, in defiance of fear? The night grew late in Budapest, the fire in the hearth dying down to embers. Christine sat once more at a table, her hands pressing another envelope closed. The sound was soft, almost inaudible, yet it marked another moment in her endless struggle. She slipped the envelope into her coat, rose without hesitation, and walked toward the door. Outside, the echo of boots on mountain paths awaited her, carrying her once more into the uncertain dark. The echo of boots on mountain paths lingered like a heartbeat in the silence of the night, and with it Christine's journey turned westward, across borders and frontiers, into the occupied soil of France. It was here, among vineyards and villages darkened by curfew, that her courage found new expression. The land groaned under the weight of occupation, its people divided between submission and defiance, between fear and loyalty. Into this fractured landscape Christine descended, not as an exile now, but as an emissary of defiance, carrying with her the unseen threads of resistance that stretched from London to the heart of Europe. Her arrival came by parachute, the roar of the aircraft fading into the blackness as she floated downward, her figure a shadow against the dim starlight. The fields below were silent save for the rustle of wind in the hedgerows. To leap from the safety of the plain into a land where capture meant torture was an act few could endure, yet Christine seemed to embrace it. The rush of air, the silence before landing, the moment of rolling into the grass, all were part of the rhythm she had come to crave. She rose quickly, gathered her parachute, and vanished into the countryside before dawn could betray her. In France, she joined the underground networks, those fragile webs of farmers, railwaymen, students, priests, and shopkeepers who risked everything to resist. Her tasks were many: to carry messages, to coordinate drops of weapons, to train others in the arts of sabotage, to maintain the lifeline between the field and London. She moved with the same blend of charm and daring that had served her in Hungary. But here the stakes were even higher, for the Gestapo's grip was ruthless, its eyes and ears everywhere. One careless word, one misplaced glance, could undo months of work and end lives. The crackle of radio became her companion. In barns and cellars, operators tapped out coded signals, their fingers quick upon the keys, their ears straining for the faint reply across the ether. Each message was a thread stretched across the channel, each pause a silence heavy with peril. Christine sat often beside these operators, watching the rhythm of their hands, memorizing the codes, helping to shield them when patrols drew near. The danger was constant. German direction finders swept the countryside, hunting the faint signals, triangulating their sources. To linger too long was to invite death, and so radios were moved, dismantled, hidden, then set up again miles away. It was a game of shadows played against an enemy who missed nothing. Christine thrived in this world. She carried arms and explosives to partisans hidden in forests, disguised as a local woman traveling with groceries. She rode bicycles down narrow lanes, messages sewn into her clothing, smiling at soldiers she passed as though she were no more than a villager on an errand. At night, she sat in darkened rooms, discussing sabotage of railways, the timing of ambushes, the delicate art of striking and vanishing before the enemy could respond. She was fearless, or seemed so, though perhaps inside she felt the same tremors as anyone, but she would never allow fear to guide her hand. The French resistance admired her, though she remained something of an enigma. She was not French, though she spoke with ease. She was not bound by ties of family here, yet she risked her life as if the soil were her own. Some suspected her of being reckless, too visible, too daring. Yet her results silenced them. Trains were destroyed, prisoners freed, weapons delivered, intelligence carried back to London. Wherever she moved, success followed, as though she carried with her a charm against failure. Still, the Gestapo was near, always near. There were close escapes, moments when suspicion turned sharp, when she found herself questioned, her heart steady, though her pulse quickened. On one occasion, stopped by a German patrol, she produced false papers with such calm that the officer, convinced of her authority, saluted and let her pass. On another, when danger pressed close, she swallowed a capsule of cyanide only to spit it out later, her teeth stained with its bitterness, a reminder of how thin the margin between life and death truly was. Her companions spoke of her resilience, of how she could travel for days with little rest, her spirit unbroken. She seemed made for this life, though it was a life that consumed others quickly. Many who worked beside her were captured, executed, or simply vanished into silence. Christine carried their memories with her, their absence a weight she never spoke of but surely felt. Perhaps it was this burden that deepened the fire in her, the determination to continue even when hope seemed fragile. And yet, in the midst of danger, there were moments of warmth. Nights spent in farmhouses where candles flickered, where bread was shared in quiet companionship, where a song might rise softly in defiance of despair. Christine laughed easily in those hours, her smile lighting the gloom, her voice steady, her presence reassuring. To those who fought beside her, she was not only a leader, but a friend, one who made the unbearable seem possible. Still, each success sharpened the enemy's pursuit. Her name, her face, her movements were whispered in the offices of the Gestapo. They sought her with a hunger that grew each time she slipped away. To them, she was a ghost, a shadow, a woman who defied their power. And in that defiance lay both her strength and her peril. There was one night when the crackle of the radio was suddenly interrupted by a knock at the door. Silence fell. The operator froze. Christine's eyes flicked toward the window. She moved quickly, gathering papers, scattering them into the fire, her movements precise, her face calm. The knock came again, harder this time, the sound of boots outside on the cobblestones. The room held its breath. Then, with a gesture, Christine indicated a back way. A narrow stair, a hidden exit. Within moments, they were gone, slipping into the night as the door was forced open behind them. Such escapes became the rhythm of her life, danger at the threshold, survival by a hair's breadth. As the months of occupation dragged on, her legend deepened. In villages and towns, whispers spread of a woman who could not be caught, who laughed in the face of death, who carried freedom in her very presence. To the enemy, she was a threat, to her comrades a beacon, To herself, perhaps, only a restless wanderer who had at last found a stage vast enough for her spirit. The nights grew colder. The radios crackled on. The coded messages carried across the void. And in one of those nights, as Christine sat listening to the faint signal from London, the sound faded suddenly into silence. She leaned closer, her brow furrowed, as though the air itself had swallowed the voice. The room was still, save for that lingering silence, a silence heavy with unanswered questions. The silence after the fading of the radio lingered like a weight in the small room, heavy as if the very air held its breath. Christine sat motionless for a moment, her dark eyes fixed upon the useless receiver, her lips pressed together in a line that revealed neither fear nor despair. She knew such silences well. In the secret war, signals were interrupted, operators were captured, entire networks vanished overnight. Yet she also knew that the struggle went on, carried by others in distant fields, whispered from other barns, tapped out from other hidden rooms. Still, silence has a way of seeping into the spirit, and it was in such moments that Christine's restlessness grew sharpest. For in the absence of sound, memory and longing found their way forward, and with them the tangle of her heart. For Christine was not only a figure of daring missions and coded envelopes, she was also a woman whose presence stirred affection, admiration, and desire in those who fought beside her. Her beauty, sharpened by danger, seemed almost luminous to men living daily under the shadow of death. Her laughter, sudden and disarming, brought warmth to comrades who had forgotten what joy felt like. And her courage, visible in every action, inspired love as much as loyalty. She was loved by many, though she belonged to none. Among her companions there were whispers of her affairs, of brief entanglements kindled in the heat of peril. To some she offered affection, perhaps comfort, perhaps a spark of life amid the ruin. Yet she remained elusive, never wholly possessed by any. Love for her was like her missions, intense, dangerous, often brief, never bound by permanence. She lived too quickly, moved too constantly to be anchored. Those who tried to hold her found only that she slipped away, her spirit untamed. One name often spoken in connection with hers was Andrzej Kowerski, a fellow Pole, an agent like herself, who shared not only her homeland but also her daring. He had lost a leg in an accident before the war, yet continued to serve with unflinching bravery. Together they undertook missions, crossing borders, deceiving guards, carrying secrets. Between them there was an intimacy born of shared danger, of long nights in safe houses, of mutual understanding that needed few words. Some said they were lovers, others that their bond was deeper than romance, a companionship forged in fire. Christine herself left no clarity, only the trace of warmth in her letters and the loyalty she showed him long after the war. But there were others, too. Men fell in love with her easily, operators, officers, fellow agents. She drew them not only by her beauty, but by the intensity of her presence. In her company, they felt more alive, as though the world itself sharpened in color. Yet such intensity also unsettled, for Christine could be cold as well as warm, dismissive as easily as affectionate. She gave what she chose, withheld what she wished, and in this freedom lay both her power and her solitude. The war itself seemed to conspire in her loves, for how can permanence exist in a world where each mission might be the last, where each parting might be final? Love became fleeting, urgent, lived in stolen hours between journeys, between parachute drops, between coded transmissions. To love Christine was to accept uncertainty, to risk heartbreak, to live in the same restless rhythm that defined her existence. Few could bear it for long, though many tried, and with love came jealousy, suspicion, betrayal. The underground world was rife with intrigue, not only against the enemy, but also within its own fragile networks. Trust was fragile, loyalties tested. Christine, with her charm and her boldness, drew admiration but also envy. Some whispered that she courted danger recklessly, that she played with hearts as she played with lives, that her daring was as much for herself as for the cause. Others questioned her loyalties, though such doubts were usually silenced by her actions. Still, in a world where betrayal could mean death, even whispers carried weight. It is said that Christine sometimes used her lovers as she used her false papers, as tools for survival, as shields against suspicion, as doors to be opened. Perhaps this is true, but it is also true that she gave herself sincerely at times, that her restless heart sought warmth even if it could not remain long. She was both spy and woman, both symbol and soul, and the two could not easily be separated. In her tangled loves, we see the reflection of the war itself, urgent, uncertain, fleeting, marked by courage and shadowed by loss. There's an image of her sitting in a dim farmhouse, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, speaking softly with a comrade whose hand she held. Outside, the night was heavy with patrols, the air tense with danger. Inside, for a brief moment, there was only the warmth of her voice, the comfort of touch, the illusion of peace. Did she love him? Perhaps. Or perhaps she loved only the moment, the fragile spark of life in the darkness. For Christine's love was always bound to the fleeting, never to the permanent. And yet, even in matters of the heart, her courage was unshaken. When betrayal came, when trust was broken, she did not falter. She carried on as she always did, her eyes fixed on the mission, her spirit anchored in defiance. Love, like fear, could not command her. She accepted it when it came. She let it go when it passed, and in this freedom she remained herself, untamed. What, then, are we to make of these tangled affections? Was she careless with hearts, or simply too honest in her refusal to pretend at permanence? Was she selfish, or merely true to her nature? Perhaps no answer is needed, for in war, love itself becomes a different thing, less a binding vow than a spark against the darkness, brief yet essential. Christine gave sparks to many, and in doing so perhaps kept alive more than one weary spirit. The silence that followed the fading radio signal returned often in her life. Silence after missions, silence after partings, silence after the laughter faded and she was once more alone. It was in such silences that she must have felt the weight of her solitude, the truth that despite her charm, despite her lovers, despite her comrades, she belonged fully to no one. She was her own, always. And so the night closed again upon her, the radio dead, the fire burning low. She sat for a moment longer, then rose, her shadow stretching across the wall. At the door she paused, as if leaving behind not only the silence of the room, but also the lingering touch of a hand just released. Outside, the air was cool, and somewhere a medal glinted in a drawer, unseen, unclaimed, waiting for a time that had not yet come. The glint of medals in a drawer, unseen by most eyes, spoke of recognition that was both given and hidden. For Christine's deeds could not be celebrated openly, not while the war still raged, not while secrecy was the breath that kept networks alive. Yet the stories of her daring reached London, passed through coded reports, carried by the lips of fellow agents who spoke her name with admiration. In the offices where maps were spread and pins marked movements across Europe, her figure grew luminous. She was spoken of not as Christina Skarbek, the restless Polish aristocrat, but as Christine Granville, Churchill's favorite spy. The phrase itself carried both honor and burden. To be singled out by the Prime Minister was to be recognized as indispensable, to be trusted with the most perilous tasks, to be praised in rooms where others were seldom mentioned. Yet it was also to attract attention, to stir envy, to invite questions. for in the world of shadows, fame was a dangerous light. The Gestapo hunted her with new intensity, and even among allies there were murmurs of unease. Could any agent so daring, so visible, remain untouched by compromise? Her medals, when they were finally bestowed, were among the highest a woman of her time could receive. The George Medal, the Order of the British Empire, the Croix de Guerre from France, honors that marked her as one of the most decorated female agents of the war. She accepted them with the same poise she had shown since childhood, though one suspects she valued them less than the memory of missions accomplished. For Christine did not live for honors. She lived for the moment of risk, for the crossing of a border, for the laughter that followed survival. The medals lay quiet in their cases, while her restless spirit moved always toward the next challenge. Still, others spoke of her with awe. Winston Churchill himself, when told of her exploits, is said to have remarked that she was his favorite spy. Whether the phrase was uttered often or only once, it clung to her name thereafter, shaping the way others saw her. To be Churchill's favorite was both blessing and curse, for it lifted her above her peers but also separated her from them. Some admired her more deeply for it. Others resented the attention she received. Yet Christine herself seemed untouched by such divisions. She sought not rivalry, only the chance to serve. Her fame, such as it was, did not make her life easier. On the contrary, it brought suspicion from those who doubted the wisdom of trusting too much to any one agent. Her charm, her beauty, her boldness, these were assets in the field, but they also raised questions. Could she be relied upon not to betray secrets under duress? Was her recklessness a danger to others? Was her hunger for risk a flaw rather than a strength? Such doubts followed her, murmured in reports, whispered in conversations, yet never disproven by her actions. For again and again she succeeded where others would have faltered. And what of Christine herself? How did she feel knowing that her name reached the highest circles, that her deeds were spoken of by generals and ministers, that she was celebrated even as she moved in disguise through occupied towns? Perhaps she felt pride, though she wore it lightly. Perhaps she felt vindication, that her restless spirit had found a stage vast enough to reveal its purpose. Or perhaps she felt only the weight of expectation, the knowledge that each new mission must equal or surpass the last, that failure was not permitted to those so highly praised. It is easy to imagine her sitting once in a safe house, the medals not yet given but already rumored, her companions speaking of honors, while she sat quietly, her gaze distant. For Christine's true reward was not the recognition of leaders, but the knowledge of lives saved, prisoners freed, trains derailed, resistance kept alive. The glitter of medals might please others, but to her they were trinkets compared to the living fire of action. She thrived in danger, not in ceremony, yet still the medals came, and with them the image of Christine as heroine. Newspapers in Britain mentioned her name cautiously. Vague outlines of her deeds whispered in print. In Poland, her legend grew larger, though her homeland lay crushed beneath occupation. For the exiles who longed for freedom, she became a figure of pride, proof that Poland still fought, that its daughters as well as its sons bore arms in secret. And in France, where she had risked so much, she was remembered as a comrade in the underground, a woman who laughed in the face of German patrols and slipped past them with weapons in her basket. But what is fame to one who lives in shadows? It is a double-edged blade, cutting both ways, for Christine's recognition made her all the more hunted. The Gestapo carried her description, her name appeared on lists, her face was remembered by those who had seen her pass. Each mission grew more dangerous, for anonymity was no longer her shield. She relied instead on her quickness, her charm, her daring, weapons more fragile than the silence that had once concealed her. And perhaps, too, fame brought her loneliness. For though she was admired, though she was honored, though Churchill himself valued her, she was still a woman apart. Her comrades loved her, yet could not fully share her burden. Her lovers adored her, yet could not hold her. Her family was distant, her homeland in chains. Fame did not bring belonging. It only deepened the truth she had always carried, that she was a wanderer, destined to move alone. The medals in their drawer gleamed faintly when touched by light, but in the dimness of a room left empty, they were as silent as the dead. Christine, restless, would not linger long enough to gaze upon them. She rose once again, her coat across her shoulders, her papers tucked inside, her spirit alive only in motion. Outside, the night waited, its silence broken, not by applause or ceremony, but by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. And in that rustle lay the transition, the sound of recognition fading into suspicion, of honor dissolving into doubt, of triumph shadowed by betrayal. For in Christine's world, medals could shine in a drawer, but in the field only coded words mattered. Only silence or speech could save or condemn. The glint of honor gave way to the murmur of suspicion, a whisper lingering like the faint sound of fireworks fading into ash. The fireworks that once lit the skies of victory drifted into ash, their brilliance fading, their echoes swallowed by the night. London rejoiced in 1945, crowds filling the streets, flags unfurled, voices raised in song and laughter. The war was over, the long darkness lifted, the shadows of fear scattered by triumph. Yet for Christine, standing amid the celebrations, the joy was edged with silence. Where others saw peace, she felt only emptiness. The world no longer needed her kind. For years she had lived in constant motion, slipping across borders, carrying codes, guiding fugitives, laughing at danger. Each moment had been urgent, each breath heavy with consequence. But when victory came, the clandestine world dissolved, its agents dismissed, its networks dismantled. Those who had been indispensable in the night now found themselves superfluous in the day. And Christine, Churchill's favorite spy, one of the most decorated women of the war, discovered that in peacetime her courage was of no account. The medals were given, ceremonies held, her name spoken with gratitude. Yet gratitude fades quickly when nations turn toward rebuilding. The Special Operations Executive, the shadow army that had embraced her, was dissolved. Files were closed, agents released, their extraordinary deeds folded into silence. Christine was left adrift, her purpose vanished. She who had crossed mountains, deceived Gestapo officers, freed prisoners from death, was now expected to live quietly, to find ordinary work, to be content with a life stripped of danger. It was a demand she could not meet. She tried at first to accept the stillness. She worked as a stewardess on ocean liners, her beauty and charm serving now as ornaments rather than weapons. Passengers admired her poise, perhaps catching a glimpse of the fire that had once burned in secret fields. Yet for Christine, the work was hollow. To pour drinks, to exchange pleasantries, to move politely among travelers, this was not life, but a shadow of life. She had risked everything for freedom, and now she found herself captive in the monotony of peacetime. Friends noticed the change. The laughter remained, but it was thinner, carrying a note of weariness. Her eyes still sparkled, but with a restlessness that could not be quieted. She moved from job to job, from place to place, never settling, always seeking something that peace could not offer. She was celebrated at dinners, admired by acquaintances, but the admiration felt shallow, a reflection of what she had been rather than what she was. And beneath it all lay a deeper wound, the sense of betrayal. For Christine had given everything. She had risked her life without hesitation, had endured hardship, had offered her very spirit to the cause of freedom. Yet when victory came, she was not welcomed as a heroine but set aside, her service acknowledged with medals that lay heavy in drawers, unused, unneeded. Britain, the country for which she had fought, offered her no permanent place, no secure livelihood. Poland, her homeland, was lost to her, consumed by Soviet control. She belonged nowhere, her allegiance spent, her courage unrewarded. What does a warrior do when the war is over? Some find new battles in politics, others retreat into quiet lives, others cannot bear the stillness and wither in its grip. Christine was among the last. The restless fire that had carried her through danger could not be extinguished, yet with no outlet it turned inward, leaving her unsettled, lonely, forever searching. The streets of London, once alive with the urgency of blackout and sirens, now seemed to her gray and stifling. The peace that others cherished was to her a kind of prison. And so she wandered. She took positions abroad, sought adventure in distant lands, returned again to London, departed once more. Each journey promised meaning, yet each ended in the same restlessness. She could not recreate the intensity of war, could not summon again the clarity of purpose that had once guided her steps across snow and shadow. The world had no place for spies in peacetime, especially women whose courage had exceeded the bounds of convention. Her lovers, too, faded. Some returned to their families, others could not endure her refusal to settle, others were lost forever to the silence of memory. Andrei Kovarsky remained close, his loyalty unwavering, but even he could not fill the void. Christine loved, but love alone could not replace the fire of mission. She needed more, always more, and peace could not give it. There is an image of her walking along the Thames on a damp evening, the river dark beneath the lights, her coat pulled close against the wind. Around her, couples strolled, children played, workers hurried home. She moved among them, yet apart, her gaze distant, her step restless. She had lived too intensely to be content with ordinary hours. The war had given her a purpose larger than herself, and now that purpose was gone. She was left with memory, with longing, with the uneasy knowledge that her finest years had already passed. And perhaps there was bitterness, too. Not only at being forgotten, but at being used. Governments had needed her courage, her beauty, her daring, and when the need was gone, they had cast her aside. She had been a weapon, wielded and then discarded. The medals were no comfort, the praise no substitute for belonging. Christine was a heroine without a home, a warrior without a war, a restless soul wandering through a peace that felt like betrayal. The fireworks of victory had faded, their ash falling into the river, leaving only the echo of cheers that no longer reached her. Christine stood apart, listening not to the laughter of peace, but to the silence of her own heart, where restlessness beat on. And in that silence, the sound of idle conversation in a bar rose faintly, as though summoning her toward the next chapter of her lonely wandering. The hum of idle conversation in a bar filled the air, glasses clinking faintly, chairs scraping on the wooden floor, laughter rising and fading like the tide. Christine sat among it, her presence both striking and solitary. She sipped her drink slowly, her eyes roaming the crowded room, though her thoughts were far away, caught not in the present chatter, but in memories of nights when whispers carried codes, when the sound of boots at the door could mean life or death. Around her now, the voices were carefree, their talk of business, of family, of trivial gossip, and she listened with the faintest trace of a smile, as though she recognized their innocence, yet could not quite share it. It was in places like these that she sought refuge in the years after the war, drifting from job to job, country to country, searching for something that might ignite again the restless fire within her. She worked as a stewardess aboard passenger ships, her beauty and poise making her a figure admired by travelers who knew nothing of her past. To them, she was simply an elegant woman serving drinks on deck, offering polite words as the sea stretched wide around them. They could not have imagined that this same woman had once carried messages through occupied Europe, that she had looked the Gestapo in the eye and laughed, that she had crossed mountains with death at her heels. The contrast must have weighed heavily on her. To serve cocktails after having served a nation, to arrange table settings after having arranged escapes from prison, to smile politely after having smiled defiantly at interrogators, such dissonance could not be borne lightly. Perhaps she endured it out of necessity, for she needed money to live, and the world offered few places to a woman whose greatest skills were in espionage. Perhaps she even enjoyed the sea breezes, the sight of distant coasts, the rhythm of journeys across oceans. Yet beneath it all lay disappointment, a hollow echo where once purpose had resounded. Other jobs followed, each as unsatisfying as the last. She worked in hotels, in shops, wherever a position could be found. Her employers admired her elegance, her command of languages, her charm with customers. But Christine did not belong in such roles, and she knew it. Her spirit was too restless, her fire too bright to be contained by routine. She moved on quickly, leaving behind each post as she had left behind so many lovers, so many safe houses, so many identities, always searching, never finding. And through it all, she remained magnetic. Men still noticed her, still fell under her spell. She was no longer the young beauty of her 20s, yet her dark eyes still held their fire. Her smile still carried the weight of experience. Her bearing still suggested a nobility that no loss could erase. Suitors appeared. Companions sought her out, yet none could hold her. She was too restless, too independent, too marked by the solitude of her own path. Relationships began and ended, leaving her once more alone, once more seeking. The medals she had received lay quiet, rarely displayed, rarely spoken of. To wear them was to invite questions. To display them was to confront the indifference of a world eager to forget. Christine did not boast of her past. She carried it within her, a secret flame that burned unseen. Yet she must have felt the sting of neglect, the knowledge that those who owed her freedom had turned away, their gratitude spent, their memory dimmed. She had given her life to the cause of liberty, and in return she had been left to fend for herself in a world that preferred to celebrate others. Her homeland, too, was lost to her. Poland, now under Soviet control, was no longer a place she could return to. The country for which she had risked her life, whose officers she had saved, whose dignity she had carried across borders, had vanished into another shadow. Christine was stateless in spirit, belonging to no land, no cause, no home. Britain had used her, honored her, then set her aside. Poland was gone. France remembered her, but from afar. She walked the streets of London, yet she was a stranger, always on the edge of belonging, never at its heart. Still, she laughed. Those who met her in these years recalled her wit, her warmth, her ability to brighten a room. She could be the center of attention when she wished, her stories captivating, her presence radiant. Yet when the laughter faded, when the bar emptied, when she returned alone to her room, there was silence. And in that silence lay the truth of her solitude. There is a memory told by one who knew her in those days, how she would sit by a window in a hotel lounge, gazing out at the rain, her cigarette burning slowly between her fingers. She said little, yet her silence spoke of distances unbridgeable by ordinary words. Those who tried to comfort her found her evasive, for she carried her sorrow inward, wrapped in layers of charm and defiance. She would not confess despair, yet it hovered near her like a shadow. Perhaps she still hoped for another mission, another call to service, another chance to live fully. Perhaps she dreamed that the world would once more require her daring, her wit, her fire. But the world had moved on. The wars of shadows continued, but they belonged to others now, to new names, new faces. Christine was a relic of a time already being forgotten, her story known only to those who had been there, and even they were fading into silence. The hum of idle conversation in the bar carried on, filling the air with trivialities. Christine finished her drink, set the glass down with quiet grace, and rose. She adjusted her coat, her eyes scanning the room one last time. Then she stepped into the night, the door closing softly behind her. Outside, the air was cool, damp with mist, the streets glistening faintly in the lamplight. She walked on, her footsteps steady, her shadow stretching across the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, the names of her lost comrades lingered, absent voices in the silence of her wandering. And as the mist thickened, the silence of absent names pressed closer, reminding her that many of those with whom she had once shared danger were now gone, their laughter extinguished, their courage buried in unmarked graves. The list grew longer with each year, and in its absence, Christine's solitude deepened. The silence of absent names on a list is heavier than any spoken word. Christine carried such a list in her heart, though she never wrote it down. It grew longer with each year, a litany of voices once bright, now extinguished. She would remember them suddenly in quiet moments, a laugh heard in a safe house, a hand gripping hers before a mission, a glance exchanged in silence when the danger was thickest. And then, when her mind reached for them again, she found only emptiness. They were gone, executed in prison yards, shot in forests, tortured into silence, or vanished altogether, leaving no trace but memory. In wartime, such losses are borne with urgency, each death a wound acknowledged quickly before the next mission demands attention. There is no time to grieve when survival itself presses. But in peace, the wounds deepen. Christine, living now in a world that had moved on, found herself haunted by the faces of the fallen. She would see them in the play of shadows on the wall, hear them in the echo of footsteps along empty corridors, feel them in the sudden stillness between heartbeats. They returned not to comfort her, but to remind her of the price paid. Among them were comrades she had admired, others she had loved, still others she had saved only to lose later. She remembered Andrzej Kowarsky, still alive, still faithful, but marked by his own scars, a man who carried loyalty as a second soul. She remembered nameless couriers who had passed her coded notes, knowing they would not live long. She remembered operators hunched over radios, their fingers quick, their courage steady, until the moment they were discovered. She remembered women like herself, who had laughed at danger, who had borne false names, who had died in silence without honor. Each memory was a spark, but together they formed a burden, heavy as stone. At times she spoke of them to friends, though her words were brief, her tone light. She would mention a name, recall a gesture, then fall silent as though the rest could not be uttered. Those who listened felt the weight beneath her casual words, but they did not press. Christine was not one to confess sorrow openly. She carried it inward, veiled beneath her charm, hidden behind her laughter. But it was there, always the list of absent names, written not on paper, but upon her soul. She must have wondered at times why she herself had survived when so many had not. Survival is a gift, but also a burden, for it demands answers that cannot be given. Was it luck, skill, destiny? Or was it merely chance, the dice falling in her favor while others fell to ruin? Such questions have no answers, yet they gnawed at her. She had lived when others more deserving, perhaps, had died. She had crossed mountains, slipped past patrols, escaped capture, while others had been less fortunate. To bear such fortune is to bear guilt, and Christine bore it with quiet grace, though it surely weighed upon her heart. There is a story told of her visiting the grave of a comrade, standing silently as the wind stirred the grass. She placed a flower there, her hand lingering on the stone, then turned away without a word. Those who saw her said her face was unreadable, her eyes distant. She did not weep, but the sorrow was evident in the stillness of her posture, in the way she carried herself as she walked away. For Christine, grief was not displayed in tears, but in silence, in the weight of her steps, in the shadows that lingered around her. In the years after the war, when others spoke of victory, Christine thought of absence. The great parades, the flags, the speeches of leaders meant little to her, for she saw not triumph, but loss. Each medal awarded, each toast raised, reminded her not of glory, but of the faces missing from the celebration. She knew the cost of freedom more intimately than most, for she had walked with those who paid it, had seen their courage, had carried their last words. Perhaps this is why she could not find peace. The world celebrated, rebuilt, turned its eyes to the future. Christine remained tied to the past, her heart bound to those who had not returned. She moved restlessly, not because she sought novelty, but because stillness brought memory too sharply. To sit quietly was to hear the voices of the absent. To rest was to feel the weight of their loss. Only in motion could she keep the silence at bay, and yet she honored them in her own way. She lived boldly, refusing to fade into obscurity. She carried their memory with her, even if unspoken, even if unrecognized. Each laugh she gave, each charm she displayed, each spark of her restless spirit was, in some sense, an offering to those who could no longer laugh, could no longer charm, could no longer live. She lived for them as much as for herself, carrying their flame within her even as the world forgot. Still, memory is a double-edged companion. It sustains, but it also wounds. Christine was sustained by the pride of what she and her comrades had done, but wounded by the absence of their presence. Their names were absent from lists of honors, their faces absent from gatherings, their stories absent from the public record. They were forgotten by nations that had needed them, by leaders who had used them. Christine did not forget, but remembrance without recognition is a lonely burden, one she bore alone. On certain evenings, perhaps in the solitude of her room, she might have taken out her medals, not to admire them, but to remember those who could not receive their own. The George Medal, the OBE, the Croix de Guerre, symbols of honor, yet also reminders of the comrades who had deserved as much and more, yet lay unrecognized in unmarked soil. The medals glinted faintly in the lamplight, but Christine's gaze, one imagines, was upon the shadows behind them, and so she lived, carrying the silence of absent names. Each day added distance between her and those memories, yet the distance did not lessen the weight. Time does not heal all wounds, some it only deepens. For Christine, time became an echo chamber in which the voices of the lost grew louder, pressing against her solitude, reminding her always of what had been given, what had been taken. The silence of absent names remained, heavy and unbroken, until at last it merged with the shifting sound of a suitcase being closed, as though she were preparing once more to move on, carrying her memories with her into yet another uncertain journey. The shifting sound of a suitcase being closed was the refrain of Christine's later years, the soft thud of leather and brass buckles fastening as she prepared once more to move on. Each departure carried with it the hope of renewal, of discovery, of some corner of the world where restlessness might ease. Yet each arrival, no matter how promising, ended in the same quiet disillusion. For Christine could not belong to any one place, any one life. She was too deeply shaped by movement, by danger, by the unfinished nature of wartime existence. She traveled widely in those post-war years, her work and her wanderings carrying her across seas and continents. As a stewardess on great liners, she sailed through the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic, to ports where the air smelled of spices and the streets thrummed with unfamiliar tongues. She drifted through Cairo, through Nairobi, through cities where the heat pressed like a heavy cloak and the stars blazed brighter than she had ever seen in Europe. For a time, she seemed at ease in this life, her charm delighting passengers, her languages smoothing conversations, her elegance admired by all who met her. Yet beneath the surface, the old disquiet stirred. To serve drinks, to smile politely, to play the role of hostess, these were tasks unworthy of the woman who had once outwitted the Gestapo. Her suitcase closed again, and she left behind the ships, the sea, the endless horizon. She took other work, hotel clerk, saleswoman, companion to wealthier friends, always moving, always searching, never satisfied. Those who knew her in these years spoke of her brilliance still, her magnetism undiminished, her ability to command a room with nothing more than her gaze. Men fell in love with her as they always had, drawn by the combination of beauty, wit, and mystery. Yet her romances followed the same pattern, intense, fleeting, unfinished. She would give herself for a time, but never wholly, and when the relationship pressed toward permanence, she withdrew. Her heart, restless as her body, could not be bound. Among these lovers were men who admired her courage, others who desired her beauty, others still who believed they could save her from her solitude. None succeeded. Christine lived on her own terms, even when those terms condemned her to loneliness. Perhaps she feared that to settle would be to betray herself, to silence the fire that had always defined her. Or perhaps she knew that no man, no matter how loyal, could ever match the intensity of the life she had known in war. How could any lover compare to the thrill of slipping past patrols, the triumph of saving comrades, the ecstasy of survival itself? Ordinary love could not compete with such memories, and so her suitcase closed again, and she moved on. Paris for a season, where the boulevards still bore scars of occupation yet glowed with new lights. Rome, where ruins whispered of empires long gone, and where Christine, walking among them, perhaps sensed her own fate mirrored in the broken arches. Tangier, with its mingling of spies and exiles, where she may have felt momentarily at home among those who lived between identities. London again, always London, the city that had once honored her and now scarcely remembered her. Her friends observed her with concern. They admired her vitality, her elegance, her quick wit, but they also saw the unease beneath. Christine seemed unable to rest, unable to find peace, unable to stop searching for something undefined. She spoke little of her wartime years, though occasionally, after a glass of wine, she would let slip a story, an escape, a deception, a rescue. Listeners leaned in, captivated, yet Christine would change the subject quickly, as though unwilling to dwell on memories too heavy or too sacred. She lived in the present, yet the past haunted her every step. The loneliness deepened with time. Her comrades from the war were fewer each year, some buried, others absorbed into new lives that left little space for old friendships. The world changed quickly in the 1950s, with new tensions, new wars, new names rising in the places where once Christine had stood. She was no longer essential, no longer called upon, no longer needed. Her fire remained, but the world had no use for it. And still, she laughed. In bars and cafes, in hotel lounges and ship cabins, Christine's laughter could still brighten the gloom, her presence could still enchant. But when she walked away, the echo of her footsteps carried a note of solitude, for beneath the surface of every smile lay the truth. She was restless, and restlessness is a form of sorrow. One imagines her packing her suitcase once more, folding dresses with careful hands, placing her few possessions neatly, as though order could disguise the chaos within. The sound of the buckles fastening was both promise and farewell. Each departure was a chance, but also a loss. She left behind places, people, possibilities, always moving forward, never settling. Her life became a string of unfinished chapters, each begun with hope, each ending with departure. Did she regret this? Did she long in secret for a home, for a companion, for the stillness she could never embrace? Or was she true to her nature, unwilling to compromise, unwilling to pretend at contentment when it was beyond her reach? Perhaps even she did not know. Restlessness had become her identity, as integral to her as her courage, her beauty, her laughter. To abandon it would be to abandon herself. The years passed, and the world paid little attention. Christine Granville, once Churchill's favorite spy, once the most decorated woman of her service, lived quietly, her legend fading, her name remembered only in fragments. She was no longer pursued by the Gestapo, no longer entrusted with missions, no longer celebrated in reports. She was a woman among many, moving through cities, carrying a suitcase, leaving behind only faint impressions in the lives of those she encountered. And yet, in those faint impressions, her spirit still glowed. Those who met her never forgot her. They remembered her charm, her wit, her restless energy. They remembered the way she seemed to belong everywhere and nowhere, the way her presence was at once captivating and unsettling. She was a woman of paradoxes, heroine and wanderer, beloved and solitary, restless and weary. The shifting sound of her suitcase being closed still echoed, even as the years grew heavy. And at last, the mirror began to reflect back not only her charm, but her weariness. The face that once turned heads now revealed lines of fatigue. The eyes that once sparked with mischief now carried shadows. Christine saw this, and perhaps she felt the edge of fear, not of danger, for she had never feared that, but of fading, of losing the power that had been her armor. She looked into the mirror, her weary face gazing back at her, a reflection both familiar and strange. The mirror offered no answers, only the truth of time. And with that truth, Christine turned away, restless still, moving on once more into the uncertain path ahead. The mirror reflected back a weary face, lined not only by time, but by a life lived always at the edge of danger and disquiet. Christine studied her own features in silence, the eyes still dark and commanding, yet marked now by shadows, the smile still quick to appear, but slower to linger. Beauty had been her ally once, as much a weapon as charm and courage, and though it had not yet abandoned her, she could see it fading, slipping quietly as all weapons eventually do. In its place was something else, something harder, something more solitary. Her days no longer brimmed with urgent missions, nor her nights with the thrill of survival. Instead, they unfolded with ordinary rhythms. Hotel corridors, small rooms rented cheaply, modest jobs taken and abandoned. She tried, as always, to laugh, to charm, to keep alive the flame that had carried her through war. But inside she felt the creeping weight of irrelevance, a burden she had never borne before. For Christine had lived her entire life defined by intensity of danger, of love, of freedom. To exist now in the dimness of peacetime, overlooked and unneeded, was to live as a shadow of herself. Men still noticed her, drawn to her presence, her elegance, the aura of mystery that clung to her. Yet the glances no longer lingered as they once had, and the admirers were fewer. Some who drew near discovered her charm undimmed, but also her impatience, her refusal to accept the mundane, her hunger for something they could not provide. Lovers came, but they did not stay. She would not allow them to. Perhaps she feared being bound. Perhaps she could not imagine love outside the urgency of war. Perhaps she knew she could never give herself fully. Whatever the reason, the pattern repeated. Affection, passion, disillusion, departure. And with each departure, her solitude deepened. It is said she would sometimes joke lightly about her own fading allure, her tone playful, her smile quick. But behind the humor lay unease. For Christine had always wielded beauty as a shield, as an entry, as a means of survival. To feel it slipping away was to feel one more weapon, stolen by time. And though her wit, her courage, her intelligence remained, the loss was not small. In a world that valued women for their youth, Christine found herself drifting further into invisibility. Her friends worried for her, though few knew how to help. Some encouraged her to write her memoirs, to preserve her story, to claim recognition. But Christine resisted. Perhaps she feared betraying secrets still bound by loyalty. Perhaps she disliked the thought of reducing her life to words on a page. Or perhaps she felt her story was already finished, its meaning sealed in the war years, its afterward a mere coda. She lived instead in fragments, an evening here, a conversation there, a fleeting romance, a restless journey. The loneliness grew sharper in these years. Though she laughed in public, though she shone in company, at night she often returned to small, solitary rooms where silence pressed heavily against the walls. Her medals lay in a drawer, unseen. Her comrades were gone or far away. The world had forgotten her, and she, though unwilling to admit it, felt the sting of that forgetting. For all her independence, all her pride, Christine had longed in her heart for recognition, not for vanity's sake, but as proof that her sacrifices, her courage, her very life had meant something. But recognition did not come. Governments moved on, wars shifted, new heroes were named. Christine's name was seldom spoken, her deeds buried in files, her legend fading into whispers. She was left to live as an ordinary woman, though she had never been ordinary and never could be. That dissonance became her sorrow. To have been extraordinary, yet to be treated as though she were nothing at all. Still, she carried herself with grace. In the bars where she sometimes sat, she spoke with wit, her laughter bright, her presence commanding. She could still charm, still draw others to her, still remind the world that she was alive. Yet those who looked closely saw the shadows in her eyes, the fatigue beneath the elegance, the loneliness behind the laughter. They saw a woman who had given everything and received little in return, a woman who carried scars invisible but heavy. There were times when she spoke bitterly of her circumstances, though rarely. More often she deflected with humor, turning sorrow into a jest, her voice light, her words sharp. But her bitterness revealed itself in her restlessness, in her inability to settle, in her constant search for something that could never be found. She was like a bird that had flown too long in storm winds, unable to fold its wings when calm arrived. The war had marked her too deeply. Peace could never soothe her. And as she moved through these years, her loneliness grew not only from the absence of others, but from the absence of herself. For Christine's identity had been forged in danger, in resistance, in the dance between life and death. To live now in obscurity was to lose that identity, to feel hollow, incomplete. She was restless not because she sought novelty, but because she sought herself and found only fragments. The mirror reflected her weariness each morning, and each evening she turned away from it. She dressed with care, carried herself with dignity, spoke with wit. But when the door closed behind her, the truth remained. She was alone, forgotten, growing older, her fire unspent, yet with no place to burn. The days folded into one another, indistinguishable. Christine, who had once lived in moments that defined nations, now measured time in idle hours, in the coming and going of trivial tasks. And each night when the lights dimmed, she must have felt the silence pressing harder, whispering of absence, of loss, of the relentless passage of time. The mirror's reflection lingered still, her weary face gazing back, until at last another shadow entered her life, a shadow too close, too insistent. It was the figure of a man whose devotion twisted into obsession, a man who followed her steps, whose presence lingered too near, whose shadow would one day close over her entirely. The shadow lingered too close, at first barely noticed, then felt as an unease, like a presence standing behind a closed door. Christine, accustomed to attention, to admiration, to fleeting affairs that burned brightly and faded quickly, did not at first regard it with much concern. Men had always been drawn to her, unable to resist the mixture of beauty and mystery, courage and fragility. She had learned to accept such attentions lightly, to laugh, to deflect, to indulge briefly before moving on. Yet this shadow was different. It did not move on, it clung. His name was George Muldowney, an Irishman, a ship's steward, a man who had crossed her path during her post-war years at sea. To him, Christine was not merely another woman, not even a woman of elegance and allure. She was an obsession. Her laughter, her poise, her restless energy, all became to him a source of both fascination and torment. He admired her, adored her, but his adoration was not gentle. It was possessive, insistent, consuming. Where others accepted her elusiveness, George could not. He wanted to hold her, to keep her, to bind her spirit. But Christine could never be bound. At first, she tolerated him, perhaps even pitied him. He was attentive, eager to please, quick to follow her wherever she went. But she soon sensed the darkness in his devotion, the instability in his gaze, the desperation that marked his presence. He could not accept distance, could not endure rejection. He hovered near her, in bars, in hotels, in streets where she wished to walk alone. His devotion was suffocating, his desire not a spark but a fire that threatened to consume. Christine had faced Gestapo interrogators with composure, had stared down suspicion at border crossings, had laughed at death itself. Yet this man's persistence unsettled her in a different way. For the Gestapo had been enemies, clear and defined, while George was something murkier, an admirer who turned into a pursuer, a lover who turned into a captor. She could not fight him as she had fought her wartime foes. His weapon was not uniformed authority, but clinging need, a need that grew darker with each rejection. Friends noticed his presence and warned her. They saw the way he followed her, the way his eyes lingered too long, the way his words trembled between adoration and menace. Christine, with her usual defiance, dismissed him lightly, confident she could handle him as she had handled so many others. Yet perhaps she underestimated the depth of his obsession, the instability of his mind, the danger that lay hidden beneath his infatuation. For Christine was always moving, always leaving, always restless. To her, love was a flame that warmed and then was gone. To George, love was a chain he would not release. The more she distanced herself, the tighter he clung. The more she laughed at his devotion, the deeper his desperation grew. What began as courtship became pursuit. What began as affection became threat. She must have felt in those years the irony of it. She had faced the greatest dangers of the war, had survived where so many had fallen, had lived when death had hunted her across mountains and through cities. Yet here, in the peace she had never embraced, danger came not from armies, but from a single man whose heart had turned into a weapon. It was a quieter danger, but no less real. The shadow of George Muldowney lengthened across her days. He appeared where she was, spoke to her when she wished silence, pressed her when she wished distance. He offered devotion as though it were gift, but Christine saw it as prison. She resisted him, rejected him, pushed him away. Yet the rejection only deepened his obsession. Love turned to jealousy, jealousy to rage. He felt betrayed by her freedom, as though her refusal to belong to him were an act of cruelty. But Christine had never belonged to anyone. Perhaps she pitied him still, even as she feared him. Perhaps she hoped he would tire, would leave, would forget. But George was not a man who could forget. His mind circled endlessly around her, unable to release its hold. He followed her not only with his steps, but with his thoughts, his words, his threats. He became, in time, the shadow that darkened every corner of her days. Christine, who had once carried secrets past border guards, who had once led men across mountains, now found herself pursued by a danger that no forged papers, no code words, no disguises could escape. She had no network to call upon, no comrades to shield her, no government to defend her. She was alone, as she had been so often since the war's end. And in that aloneness, the shadow drew closer. What did she think in those quiet moments when his presence pressed too near? Did she reflect on the strange cruelty of fate, that her greatest peril should come not from enemies in uniforms, but from the hands of a man who claimed to love her? Did she feel despair, or did she steel herself as she always had, determined to face danger without flinching? We cannot know. She spoke little of it, revealed little of her fear. She bore it with the same poise she had borne everything, her face calm, her spirit restless. And yet the shadow remained, looming nearer, darker, heavier with each passing day. George Muldowney could not release her, and Christine Granville could not be bound. Between them lay a tension that could not endure without breaking. The moment of breaking had not yet come, but its presence was felt already, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon, its thunder silent but inevitable. The shadow lingered too close, and Christine, weary though still proud, moved through the streets of London with it at her side. She adjusted her coat, lifted her head, laughed when she could. But in her eyes, perhaps, there flickered a recognition that danger once more had found her. It followed her now, not in the uniforms of an occupying force, not in the boots of patrols, not in the coded silence of radios, but in the footsteps of a single man whose devotion had twisted into doom, and his shadow lingered at the threshold, waiting for the echo of a locked door to close upon them both. The echo of a locked door lingered in the hallway, a sound both ordinary and ominous, the kind of sound that closes off safety as well as secrecy. Christine had heard such echoes before, doors shutting behind her in safe houses, doors closing in interrogation rooms, doors that separated her from freedom by only a sliver of chance. But this door belonged not to a Gestapo prison or a farmhouse in hiding. It belonged to a modest London hotel, the Shelbourne, where she had taken a small room in the summer of 1952. Here she was no longer the celebrated agent of Churchill's secret armies, no longer the daring figure who crossed borders in the snow. She was a woman alone, weary, restless, still moving through the world with the grace of habit but stripped of purpose. Yet danger had not abandoned her, even in obscurity. It came not from governments or enemies, but from George Muldowney, the ship's steward who had become her shadow. His obsession, once framed as devotion, had curdled into menace. He followed her still, his presence a constant weight. She had rejected him, firmly, repeatedly, her words leaving no doubt. She had laughed at him, dismissed him, told him she wanted no part of his love, but George could not release her. To him, rejection was betrayal, and betrayal demanded redress. His mind, unsettled, circled endlessly around her refusal, feeding upon it, turning it into anger, into desperation, into a plan. Christine must have sensed it, the way one senses a storm gathering before a drop of rain has fallen. She had always been attuned to danger, her instincts sharpened by years of survival. Perhaps she quickened her pace when she knew he was near. Perhaps she turned suddenly in the street, catching his gaze in the crowd. Perhaps she spoke lightly to friends, masking unease with humor. But she knew. The shadow was too close, the devotion too insistent, the presence too heavy. On that night in June, the hotel was quiet, its corridors dimly lit, its carpets muffling footsteps. London outside hummed with ordinary life, with buses clattering along their routes, with voices drifting from pubs, with the city moving on in peace. Christine returned to her room, her day behind her, her spirit perhaps weary but still unbroken. She had lived too long in restlessness to expect peace, but she may have hoped at least for solitude. The locked door closed behind her, sealing her in, sealing him out, or so she might have believed. But George Muldowney waited. His jealousy, his anger, his desperation pressed against his thoughts like a hand upon his throat. He could not accept her rejection. He could not endure her freedom. To him, her refusal was not the simple choice of a woman, but a wound upon his very being. And so, in the corridors of the Shelbourne Hotel, he confronted her. What words were spoken that night, we cannot know. Perhaps she laughed at him, as she had so often laughed at danger. Perhaps she dismissed him sharply, unwilling to indulge his persistence. Perhaps she tried to reason with him, her voice calm, her poise unbroken. But George, unstable, consumed by obsession, could not hear reason, could not endure laughter, could not accept dismissal. His devotion had become a knife in his hand, and in that moment it found its mark. The attack was sudden, brutal, the act of a man who had confused love with possession, devotion with destruction. Christine, who had faced Gestapo officers with fearless eyes, who had carried cyanide in her teeth, who had crossed borders under the threat of execution, met her end not in a battlefield or prison but in the narrow corridor of a London hotel, felled by the hand of a jealous lover. She died quickly, her body collapsing in silence, her spirit departing in a moment both ordinary and tragic. There's a cruel irony in it. The woman who had escaped every trap, who had survived every mission, who had walked away from dangers that consumed others, was undone not by empires or armies, but by the frailty of one man's heart. Her courage, her wit, her charm, her restless fire, all could not protect her from the shadow that had followed her too closely, too insistently, until at last it closed over her. And yet, even in her death, her dignity remained. Witnesses spoke of her beauty, still evident, her presence undiminished, her bearing proud even in collapse. They spoke of her as extraordinary, a heroine whose life had been larger than life, whose death was unworthy of her. The newspapers carried the story briefly, a column here, a headline there, noting her past with cautious words, recording her end with little fanfare. The world, so quick to forget, turned its gaze elsewhere. But for those who knew her, who had fought beside her, who remembered her laughter in the face of danger, her death was more than tragedy. It was betrayal, by fate, by the world that had discarded her, by the peace that had left her defenseless. She had given everything, and in the end she had been left with nothing but the locked door of a hotel and the knife of a jealous man. The echo of that locked door lingered still, reverberating in silence, marking the end of her restless journey. Yet in that echo there was also a question, unresolved, unanswered. Was her fate inevitable? The final chapter of a life that could never find peace? Or was it simply chance, cruel and meaningless, that she should meet her end in such a way? The corridor held no answer. It offered only silence, heavy and unbroken, waiting for footsteps that would come too late. And those footsteps, the footsteps of police summoned after the act, were already approaching, their sound faint at first, then louder, echoing down the same corridor where Christine's life had slipped away. The footsteps of police arriving too late echoed along the corridor, steady and unhurried, a sound that carried no urgency, for urgency was already gone. The locked door had yielded, the shadow had fled, and Christine lay silent upon the floor, her life spilled out in an instant that no one could reverse. The officers moved with the calm precision of men accustomed to such scenes, yet even they must have paused, if only briefly, at the sight before them. A woman of unmistakable presence, fallen not in battle but in the dim anonymity of a hotel hallway. Her body was still, her features composed even in death, as though dignity clung to her until the very last. The light overhead cast long shadows, making her appear both fragile and monumental at once. She who had defied the Gestapo, who had walked across snowy mountains, who had laughed at interrogators, lay now as any mortal might, undone by a single thrust of steel. The silence around her was immense, broken only by the murmurs of witnesses, the scratching of pens on notepads, the measured voices of the police recording what had happened. Some recognized her name when it was spoken aloud, though few truly understood what it meant. Christine Granville, they said, a stewardess, a woman once of some distinction. They did not know that she had been Christina Skarbek, Churchill's favorite spy, the most decorated woman of her kind, a heroine whose courage had tipped the balance in battles unseen. To them, she was simply another victim of violence, another tragedy to be noted and filed away. The weight of her life could not be measured in that dim hallway, and so it was not measured at all. The murderer was found swiftly. George Muldowney, still trembling with the frenzy of his act, did not flee far. His obsession had bound him too tightly to her even in death. He confessed, his words broken, his demeanor wild, a man undone by his own passion. The law would take its course, though no sentence, however severe, could undo what had been lost. Christine was gone, and with her passed a chapter of history that few had cared to remember until that night forced them to. Her friends grieved, though their voices were not loud. Those who had known her in the war, who had fought beside her, who had shared danger and laughter, received the news with disbelief that Christine, who had survived so much, should die in such a manner seemed impossible. They recalled her defiance, her wit, her charm, her endless courage, and could not reconcile it with the image of her body in a London corridor. For them, her death was not only tragedy, but insult, a fate unworthy of the life she had lived, and yet, unworthy as it seemed, it was final. The newspapers reported it briefly, their tone factual, their words restrained. There was no great outpouring of tribute, no headlines proclaiming the loss of a national heroine. Her story had already faded from public memory, and her death was treated as the sad but ordinary tale of a woman slain by a jealous man. The world moved on, as it always does, indifferent to the magnitude of her life. Still, in quieter places, her memory lingered. Those who had seen her cross mountains remembered her steady step. Those who had laughed with her in safe houses remembered her quick smile. Those who had fought beside her remembered the strength she lent them when hope faltered. To them, her death could not erase her life, but even they, scattered and diminished by time, could not give her the recognition she deserved. Her story slipped further into obscurity, her grave soon to be one among many. The police did their work, the hotel returned to silence, the world continued its course. Yet for those who paused to think, the image of Christine's final moments remained. A woman who had given all she had, who had risked all she was, ended alone, betrayed not by enemies in uniforms, but by the twisted devotion of one who claimed to love her. The irony was bitter, the lesson unclear. Was it fate, chance, or the inevitable end of a life lived without compromise? The question lingered, unanswered. There is a stillness that follows violence, heavier than the act itself. That stillness filled the corridor long after Christine was taken away. It settled into the walls, into the carpets, into the very air, as though the building itself understood what had passed. Guests whispered of it. some crossing themselves, others avoiding the place where she had fallen. For even among strangers, her presence was felt and her absence marked. Her body was carried away, her belongings gathered, her room emptied. The suitcase that had so often accompanied her was closed for the last time, its contents ordinary, its significance immense. Within it were the traces of her final days, clothes neatly folded, letters unfinished, tokens of a life that had never truly found rest. The suitcase, silent and unremarkable, was all that remained of her wandering spirit. Outside, the city carried on. Buses clattered, pubs hummed, lovers strolled along the Thames. Life was indifferent, as it always is, to the passing of one soul, no matter how extraordinary. Christine's death did not alter the course of nations, did not shift the balance of power. Yet for those who knew her, and for those who later came to learn her story, it was a moment of reckoning, a reminder of how easily heroes are forgotten, how swiftly sacrifice is erased, how cruelly fate can strike. The footsteps of the police faded, the corridor emptied, the silence remained, and into that silence came the sound of rain against cold stone, falling upon her grave, where her body would soon rest beneath the soil of a land that had been her refuge, but never her home. The cold stone of her grave beneath the rain bore witness to the end of Christine's long wandering. Raindrops slid across the carved letters of her name, mingling with the earth that had been turned fresh and dark. Around her the cemetery lay quiet, its paths glistening, its trees heavy with water, the silence broken only by the soft tapping of drops on leaves. It was an ordinary resting place for an extraordinary life, a modest plot among many, unmarked by ceremony grand enough to match her deeds. And yet here, beneath the London sky, her body came to rest at last, though her spirit had never been one to rest. The service was small. A few friends, some comrades who remembered her from the war, stood in silence as the coffin was lowered. Their faces were somber, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that this woman who had risked all for freedom had died not in glory, but in loneliness, not by enemy fire, but by the hand of a man who claimed to love her. They bowed their heads, spoke quiet prayers, laid flowers dampened by the rain. There were no bands, no flags, no speeches from officials. The governments she had served so fiercely were absent. Her burial was the quiet farewell of a few, not the recognition of a nation. And yet, even in that small gathering, there was a sense of reverence. Those who knew her remembered the mountains she had crossed, the codes she had carried, the prisoners she had freed. They remembered her laughter, her defiance, her beauty. They remembered the way she had lived without hesitation, always at the edge, always restless. And in their memories, she was not merely a fallen woman in a grave, but a symbol of courage, of resilience, of the unyielding spirit that refuses to be broken. The newspapers carried brief notices of her death. The headlines spoke more of the crime than of the life, more of the jealous steward than of the fearless agent. A few lines mentioned her service, her medals, her role in the war, but the words were restrained, the space allotted small, the tone cool. The world had already moved on to other stories, other concerns. Her passing was noted but not honored, recorded but not celebrated. The woman who had been Churchill's favorite spy, who had lived as a legend, was remembered in print only as a victim of violence. Her medals remained in drawers, her files in archives, her story scattered in fragments. The governments that had once relied on her had no use for her memory now. She was one of many, her courage folded into the anonymity of history. Yet for those who paused to think, who read between the lines, who remembered the war not only in battles but in whispers and shadows, her name carried weight. They knew that without her and others like her, the tide of darkness might not have been turned. In the years that followed, her grave became a place of quiet pilgrimage, for the few who still remembered. Veterans, Poles in exile, friends who had survived, came to stand before the stone, to leave flowers, to whisper her name. They stood in silence, the rain or sun upon them, their memories heavy with the faces of the absent. Christine was not alone in that soil. She lay among thousands of forgotten heroes, each with their own story, each with their own sacrifice. But to those who knew, her name stood out, a spark of defiance in the long shadow of forgetting. Perhaps she would not have minded the modesty of her burial. She had never sought recognition, never craved applause. She had sought only action, only purpose, only the fire of the moment. Yet even she must have wished, in some quiet corner of her heart, for remembrance, for acknowledgement that her life had meant something. And if the nations forgot, perhaps it was enough that the rain remembered, that the earth carried her story, that the wind whispered her name. The rain fell steadily, pattering on stone, soaking the flowers, seeping into the soil. It was the same rain that had fallen on the fields of Poland, on the mountains of Hungary, on the rooftops of France. It was the same rain that had accompanied her through escapes and crossings, through laughter and sorrow. Now it fell upon her grave, binding her journey together, sealing her story with a rhythm as ancient as time. Those who left the cemetery that day carried her memory with them, each in their own way. Some spoke of her courage, others of her beauty, others of her tragedy. All carried a sense of loss, not only of a friend, but of something greater, the loss of a spirit too rare to be easily replaced. Christine's life was gone, her body returned to the earth, but her presence lingered, invisible yet undeniable, in the hearts of those who had known her. And so her story might have ended, quietly, with rain on cold stone, with a name fading into obscurity. Yet stories do not always end where lives do. They continue in whispers, in questions, in reflections passed from one generation to another. Christine's life, though forgotten by many, remained alive in fragments, in memories, in the lingering sense that she had been more than ordinary, more than her fate. Her grave held her body, but her story could not be confined. The cold stone beneath the rain remained, but above it the air carried questions still unanswered, waiting for another voice, another time to give them form. Did she find what she sought in life? Did she regret her choices? Did she long for peace, or was restlessness her true companion to the end? The rain offered no answers, only its steady rhythm, as though inviting those who lingered to wonder in silence. And from that silence rose the faint smoke of a candle burning low, a flame that flickered once more before surrendering to the dark. The candle burned low, its flame wavering, its smoke already curling upward into the still air. It flickered once more, then bent toward darkness, leaving only the faint trace of its presence behind. So too did Christine's life pass, bright, unyielding, restless, and then gone, leaving behind the memory of fire rather than the permanence of stone. Her story, scattered across continents and whispered in fragments, was never given the full recognition it deserved, yet it remains, like the ember of a candle long extinguished, capable of lighting the imagination of those who pause to remember. She was born into a world already marked by division, raised in a land whose soil carried the memory of conquest and loss. From childhood, she was restless, unwilling to accept the limits placed upon her, unafraid of pain, unwilling to bow to custom. That restlessness, which unsettled her youth and troubled her marriages, became in war the very quality that saved her and others. She refused stillness, refused submission, refused despair. At every turn she chose motion, chose risk, chose defiance. The war gave her purpose, and she gave herself entirely to it. Her deeds are known, though often in outline rather than detail. She crossed mountains with messages sewn into her clothing, charmed guards with a smile that concealed her defiance, led fugitives across snow, laughed at interrogators, carried secrets that shaped the course of battle. She freed prisoners, coordinated resistance, carried hope where hope was nearly extinguished. She was decorated with medals, praised by Churchill, admired by comrades, envied by rivals, feared by enemies. She lived as few could imagine and survived where many could not. And yet, when victory came, it offered her no peace. The very qualities that had made her indispensable, her restlessness, her defiance, her hunger for risk, became in peacetime burdens rather than gifts. Governments set her aside, her medals tucked away, her name fading from the record. She drifted through jobs, through cities, through lovers, always searching for a purpose that peace could not provide. She was admired still, yet she was also forgotten, her heroism unacknowledged, her sacrifices unrewarded. Her end came not on the field of battle, not in the hands of the enemy, but in the corridor of a London hotel, at the knife of a man whose love had turned to possession, whose devotion had become destruction. It was a death unworthy of her life, a tragedy both intimate and ordinary, yet all the more cruel for that. She had survived the greatest dangers of her age, only to be undone by a danger born of loneliness and obsession. What remains of her? A grave in London where rain falls on cold stone, a few lines in newspapers, a scattering of files in archives, medals in drawers, their metal untarnished, their meaning dimmed, memories carried by those who once knew her, now themselves long gone. And yet beneath the silence, her story endures. It endures because courage such as hers cannot be erased, because the memory of defiance lingers even when unspoken. It endures because there is something in her restlessness that speaks to the human soul, the refusal to settle, the hunger to live fully, even in the face of death. Christine's life is not easily judged. Was she a heroine, or was she reckless? Was she loyal, or was she simply unwilling to be bound by any one allegiance? Did she live for freedom or for the thrill of risk? The answers shift like shadows, offering no certainty. Perhaps that is fitting, for Christine herself was never simple, never confined to one role, never willing to be defined by others. She was at once brilliant and flawed, courageous and restless, admired and alone. She lived as she wished, even when that life led to sorrow. And what of her death? Did she sense it coming, as she must have sensed so many dangers before? Did she see in George Muldowney not only a man, but a fate, the embodiment of a shadow that had always followed her? Did she, in her final moments, regret the path she had chosen, or did she accept it as the only path she could ever have walked? We cannot know. Her silence in death leaves us only with questions, yet perhaps the questions are the true legacy. For Christine's life reminds us that heroism is not tidy, not easy, not without cost. It is restless, flawed, human. It leaves behind as many doubts as certainties. She was not a saint, nor was she merely a victim. She was a woman who gave herself wholly to the cause of freedom, who lived without compromise, who refused to be ordinary. Her end was tragic, but her life was extraordinary, and it is in that paradox that her story finds its meaning. The candle has burned low, its flame gone, its smoke fading, but the memory of its light remains. Christine Granville, Christina Skarbek, lives on not only in medals or in archives, but in the imagination of those who remember courage, who honor defiance, who see in her restlessness a mirror of their own. She was forgotten by the world, but she need not be forgotten by us. And so her story closes, unresolved, like the final note of a song left hanging in the air. Did she live and die as she wished? Perhaps. Or perhaps she sought something even she could not name. What we know is this: She lived fully, fiercely, without compromise. And in that living she left behind a flame that, though small, will not be extinguished. The candle burns no more, but its smoke drifts upward, carrying with it the memory of her name, lingering in the silence, waiting for those who will listen.